At 05:34 hours local time, a massive explosion tore through the Vladislavivka area on the Crimean Peninsula, visible from the coast 8 miles away. Columns of black smoke rose into the sky, reaching 350 feet high. 560,000 liters of fuel, along with 725 tons of ammunition and weapons, had gone up in flames. But what made this attack completely different from every other strike you have ever seen? It was speed and distance. The Russian supply train had been moving deep inside the Crimean Peninsula, where Russia had always claimed full control, and it was protected by air defense systems that were supposed to make it untouchable. 8 Ukrainian pilots were about to prove that nowhere in Crimea was safe anymore, and that Ukraine would encircle and isolate it. And they would do it with drones cheaper than an old used car. 25 miles away, members of the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, were watching distorted, broken video signals through video transmitter systems that were never supposed to work at this distance. 8 FPV drones were using speed to overcome distances that every Russian military expert had called impossible. Standard drones usually operate within a range of 3 to 20 miles, but these had already reached 22 miles and were still pushing farther. Behind the attack formation, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, continuously provided real-time updates on the train's position. At the same time, SBU units intercepted Russian communications, monitored the reactions of the security forces, and assessed the level of electronic interference around the target. If the signal was choked off, the next team was ready to activate anti-jamming equipment to punch through the electromagnetic curtain. Suddenly, the image on the control screen began to flicker between heavy static and complete signal loss. There was no warning. The attack drone had just lost contact with its operator. The control signal had been cut off halfway through. The first Wardog TRN, the critical relay drone that made this 25-mile long-range strike mission possible, had just been destroyed. A Russian Juran 2 had launched an R-60 air-to-air missile, hitting the Wardog TRN while it was relaying signals at an altitude of 1,800 feet. And without it, the attack drones would not be able to receive commands. The entire mission was only seconds away from failure. This is the greatest challenge of extreme long-range drone operations. Ukrainian forces use VTX, video transmitter, signal transmitters on the 5.8 GHz band because they have almost no latency. Digital signals may be easier to expand, but a 220 millisecond delay makes precision strikes almost impossible. When an FPV is flying at 90 miles per hour toward a moving train, 220 milliseconds can make it miss the target by 25 feet, hitting the place where the train had just been. That is why Ukraine still uses the 5.8 GHz VTX system, even though it means they must position vulnerable Wardog TRN relay drones every 5 kilometers. The SBU device operator stared at the screen. 3 seconds passed, then 5 seconds. Then the backup relay activated. The second Wardog TRN had been flying at a lower altitude, only 700 feet. That made it harder to detect, but it was 2 miles away from the optimal position. Signal strength dropped to 50%, causing the video image to shake, distort, and cut in and out. But it was enough. The backup relay station had now become the vital link in the chain stretching all the way to the Crimea supply train, carrying 560,000 liters of fuel, along with 725 tons of ammunition and weapons. But this was not a solo operation by the SBU equipment team. The mission involved multiple specialized groups coordinating at the same time. GUR Intelligence had tracked this train for weeks, learning its movement schedule and the configuration of the fuel, ammunition, and weapons cars. The SBU electronically monitored Russian communications to detect any sign that the mission had been exposed. The next team was always ready with their anti-jamming equipment. Each unit had its own role. The SBU controlled the attack drones. GUR Intelligence provided real-time updates. The SBU intercepted Russian responses. And the 413th Raid Regiment would break through the jamming system when necessary. The strategy of using backup relays was not a random contingency plan. Ukrainian forces always deploy 3 relays for each link chain, with 2 backups flying at different altitudes. The main Wardog TRN hovered at 1,800 feet to optimize signal transmission. The first backup maintained an altitude of 700 feet, making it harder to detect, but with reduced transmission range. The second backup flew close to the ground at only 330 feet, almost invisible to air defense systems, but used only in an emergency. They maintained a distance of 2 miles from one another to avoid having multiple targets shot down by a single missile. The SBU system operators had been trained for exactly this scenario. Every pilot had spent more than 200 hours in the simulator cockpit, flying under degraded signal conditions, learning to use railway tracks, rivers, and power lines as reference points when video quality dropped. They practiced flying with extremely limited visibility for up to 20 seconds, relying on timing and memorized terrain to keep the aircraft on course. And they constantly changed direction, altitude, and unexpected scenarios to prepare for this mission. Those repeated commands helped the FPV keep flying when technology began to malfunction. The Russians knew Ukrainian drones were coming. They always knew that. The only question was whether their defenses could stop them. In the distance, the Crimea supply train continued rolling forward at 40 miles per hour. It had no idea that 8 FPVs were heading straight toward it. The lead drone needed to fly another 13 miles to reach the train. What happened next would decide whether Ukraine's bold plan would succeed or whether the 8 FPVs would be easily brought down by Russia. But as the lead drone pushed deeper into the Crimean Peninsula at the 15-mile mark, it began entering an extremely powerful electronic jamming zone. The video image started to collapse into chaos. It flickered, froze, broke apart, and almost disappeared completely. Random pixels flashed across the screen, then vanished within fractions of a second. The FPV had just entered the operating zone of this system Russia had deployed to protect the supply corridor on the peninsula, Pole 21. This electronic warfare system was designed as a wide-area navigation jamming network. Its modules could be mounted on antenna masts and communications towers in the Crimean Mountains, operating across the frequency range from 1,176.45 MHz to 1,575.42 MHz, creating an electronic curtain over an area with a radius of 35 miles. Its purpose was to make aircraft no longer know where they were. Pole 21 attacked satellite navigation signals such as GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, and Beidou. Because those signals are already very weak when they travel from orbit down to the ground, a stronger transmitter near the target area is enough to blind a UAV's navigation device. On the screen, the GPS position began jumping wildly. The displayed coordinates drifted away from reality. A flight path that seemed to lead straight toward the train suddenly became a meaningless curve. At least, that was what Russia wanted to happen. The SBU operator immediately switched into anti-jamming mode. The VTX video transmitter on the 5.8 GHz band was still working, but the image quality had dropped sharply. They could no longer trust GPS. They could no longer trust the digital map. From this moment on, the FPV had to be flown by sight, by memory, and by the few blurred frames still remaining on the screen. The jamming patterns were not completely random. Pole 21 could create a wide coverage area, but it could not change the fact that its jamming modules usually focus their power on satellite navigation signals. That created a weakness. If the UAV no longer depended entirely on GPS, this jamming curtain could not kill the mission immediately. So the Ukrainian operator did what they had practiced hundreds of times. They ignored the coordinates jumping across the screen, they looked at the railway tracks, they looked at the tree line, they looked at the direction of the power lines stretching across the ground. Tiny details on the surface became the only navigation system still worth trusting. For 15 tense seconds, the FPV was almost flying in darkness. GPS showed its position 5 miles away from reality. Satellite navigation signals were distorted by the Pole 21 curtain, but the operator still held the aircraft on course with the map in his head, counting each second to estimate distance and using the terrain below to lock the attack path again. Behind the lead drone, the 7 remaining FPVs followed at an exact interval of 30 seconds. That spacing was not random. If they flew too close together, the same jamming zone could make all 8 lose orientation at the same time or collide with one another. If they flew too far apart, the lead drone's experience in crossing the jamming layer would no longer help those behind it. 30 seconds was just enough. The second drone could observe how the lead aircraft passed through the Pole 21 zone, copy the successful flight path, and adjust before its own navigation signal was deceived. The six behind it did the same, following the errors the first aircraft had paid the price to discover. Then, the breakthrough they needed arrived. Ukraine's assault team activated the counter-electronic warfare system. This was not a subtle trick. This was the direct force of electronic warfare. A powerful directional signal transmission was pushed through the jamming layer, strong enough to restore the image for a short time and help the operator lock back onto the railway tracks below. But it came at a very high cost. For 30 seconds, Ukraine's signal emitting position lit up on Russian detection systems like a beacon in the darkness. That window was a calculated risk. Ukrainian intelligence knew that Russian artillery reaction time averaged 40 seconds from detection to the first volley, and 30 seconds of clear signal was enough for the FPVs to cross the most heavily jammed stretch of airspace. The operator of the next team kept his hand on the power switch, eyes locked on the timer. At the 25-second mark, they cut the transmission and immediately moved away from the position. They gave themselves a brief 5-second safety margin before Russian artillery could react. The video image returned, blurry but usable. Through the remaining interference, the operator saw the railway tracks below. The FPV had now dropped to an altitude of 180 feet, hugging the rail line and using the two long steel strips of track as a guide that no false GPS signal could hide. But Pole 21 was only the first protective layer. As the drones continued forward, the Russians began preparing the next defensive layer. The Ukrainian operators switched fully to manual control, abandoning any hope of relying on GPS. From here on, the mission depended only on the operator's eyes, low-quality video signal, and the experience they had trained for. The supply train was now only 6 miles away. It was still rolling along the tracks. At the same time, Russian air defense crews were urgently turning toward the incoming threat. And in just a few minutes, Russian commanders would realize a bitter truth. The very detection and jamming layer they believed was a safe shield was unintentionally guiding Ukrainian drones straight toward the target. When the Pole 21 electronic warfare system began jamming, it did not only disrupt the navigation signals of the Ukrainian FPVs. At the same time, stations inside this network also collected data on real-time coordinates, flight trajectories, thermal signatures, and target identification features, then transferred all of that information to the Panzer S-1 air defense system protecting the railway line. Panzer's 1RS-2-1 radar locked onto the incoming formation. After receiving the information, the automated system began calculating the launch angle, closing speed, and interception point. Only 10 seconds remained before the 57 E-6 missile would leave the launcher. But the Ukrainians were already very familiar with this Russian interception method. They had prepared an unexpected option. 8 new targets appeared on Russian screens. These were decoy drones with the same shape, size, and radar cross-section as the earlier FPVs. The only difference was that they carried no warhead. That made them cheap and, more importantly, much faster and far more maneuverable. To the Panzer S-1 targeting computer, a cheap decoy and a warhead-carrying attack FPV were now almost impossible to distinguish immediately. The Russian operators were forced to make a choice: attack all targets and accept missile expenditure, or try to distinguish the real targets within a few seconds and risk allowing the FPVs to break through. They chose to fire. The Panzer S-1 launcher rose. 8 missiles were launched in sequence, tearing through the low sky above the railway line. 6 FPVs were hit almost immediately, but only 2 real targets were eliminated, while 4 warhead-carrying FPVs continued racing toward the target. At this point, the Russians still had 4 57 E-6 missiles left, but reload time was up to 16 minutes, and there was not enough time. The air defense crew immediately switched modes. 2 30mm 2A38M automatic cannons began firing at a rate of 5,000 rounds per minute, creating a dense net of bullets in front of the drones. The Ukrainian pilots knew this. They immediately forced the formation down close to the ground. The surviving FPVs dropped to an altitude of only 30 feet, below the Panzer S-1's minimum engagement altitude of 45 feet. At this height, the radar began struggling to separate the targets from ground clutter, and the FPVs were almost sliding over the grass. This was the most dangerous airspace of the mission. Fly higher, and they would enter Panzer's interception zone again. Fly lower, and even the smallest error could send them crashing into the ground, tree lines, power poles, or wires crossing the terrain. At 90 miles per hour, every second could be the last. Power lines appeared on the screen only at the final moment. Trees suddenly rose out of the distorted image. Even a large bird could become a deadly obstacle if it struck the propeller at this altitude. The SBU pilots had been trained for exactly that situation. Before the mission, they studied satellite images of the route, memorizing every section of railway, every tree line, every power pole, and every mound of earth that could hide an obstacle. In the simulator cockpit, they repeated this flight path again and again until it became a map inside their minds. At mile 8, climb slightly to clear the observation post. At mile 9, bank right to avoid the communications tower. Then descend again, hug the railway line, and maintain speed. Meanwhile, Pole 21 continued jamming and feeding data back to the Russian air defense system, but it ran into a problem the Russians could not solve immediately. It could disrupt GPS. It could make coordinates jump wildly. It could report the approach direction to Panzer S1. But it could not completely erase the video transmitter image from the 5.8 GHz VTX feed. The video signal was degraded, but it was not dead. Even when the image flickered and broke apart, just 0.5 seconds of visibility was still enough for a skilled pilot to see the railway, recognize the tree line, and keep the FPV flying. Only 3 miles from the target, the Russian supply train received the warning. Ukrainian drones had broken through the air defense layer and were racing toward the train. The train horn screamed along the tracks as the driver immediately pushed the throttle forward. The train began accelerating because if it could just cross the railway bridge ahead, it would almost be safe. At the same time, the R330ZH jamming device mounted on the train itself was activated. The GPS signal disappeared instantly. GLONASS disappeared as well. Even the magnetic compass began to behave incorrectly. But the video signal, the video transmitter feed, degraded by static interference, continued to come through. At this point, the Ukrainians were flying the drones entirely by sight through a screen that looked like an old television. On the screen, they no longer saw a clear image, only patches of static, the shadows of the railway tracks and train cars appearing and disappearing. A train moving at 50 miles per hour, combined with navigation signals erased from the screen, was much harder to hit than a stationary target. The probability of striking the fuel compartment or artillery shells to create a major explosion was only about 10%, and the Ukrainians began looking for the most accurate way to hit it. 2 decoy drones carrying no warheads suddenly accelerated to 120 miles per hour, surged ahead of the train, and began reconnaissance. Through the shaking, distorted video image, the operators began scanning the terrain ahead of the railway line. Then they discovered something even more important than the train. A railway bridge stood about 3 miles ahead of the train's current position. The information was immediately sent back to the control crew. Within seconds, the entire plan changed. They would strike the route the train was forced to pass through first, making it stop. A lead FPV carrying a warhead immediately broke away from the formation. Its engine roared as it accelerated to 100 miles per hour, racing straight toward the railway bridge ahead. On the control screen, the image shook with every pulse. The tracks, the bridge deck, and the concrete supports emerged through the layer of signal interference. The FPV dropped lower, followed the railway line, and drove straight into the joint between the main bridge support and the bridge girder. At the moment of impact, the RPG-7 warhead detonated. A burst of fire flashed beneath the steel structure. The bridge girder shook violently, lifted out of position on its support, and shifted away from the rail line. Behind it, the train driver saw it too late. The bridge ahead had broken. He pulled the emergency brake. Steel wheels screamed against the rails, sending a piercing sound through the air. The entire train shuddered, the rear cars pushing forward with force, while the locomotive struggled to slow down before the destroyed bridge section. The driver immediately called for support, reporting that the railway line had been cut and the train was under attack. But for Ukraine, that moment was the real opportunity. They had only 3 warhead-carrying FPVs left. There was no room for error. Each one had to hit a position capable of creating the largest possible chain damage. Through the jammed video screen, the operators began counting the train cars through the static-filled control feed. 1, 2, 3. The fuel cars were the first target. If hit, fire would spread along the train and cover the cars behind them. The ammunition cars were the second target. If they exploded, they could trigger a chain of secondary blasts and destroy the neighboring weapons cars. The first operator marked the target in his mind. The fuel car was the fourth car behind the locomotive. The second operator shifted to the next position. The ammunition car was in the middle of the train, car number 12. The third operator kept the remaining FPV behind the formation. If anything went wrong, he would be the perfect backup option. And just one accurate hit could turn the entire train into an uncontrollable chain of explosions. At a distance of 0.5 miles, the image on the screen began breaking up almost completely. The R-330 JA on the train was gaining the upper hand, crushing the video transmitter signal with crude electromagnetic interference. What remained on the screen was only shattered patches of light and darkness, the shadows of the rails, and train cars appearing and disappearing. The Ukrainians were basically flying blind. At this point, they were relying entirely on memory, instinct, and what they had practiced hundreds of times inside the simulator cockpit. Below, Russian soldiers on the train had realized the threat was coming. They immediately jumped down on both sides of the tracks, running for cover while raising their AK-47s toward the sky and firing at the UAV swarm. Bursts of gunfire cut through the smoke and dust, but at the FPV's diving speed, all of it was almost nothing more than a desperate reaction. 3 seconds to impact. 2 seconds. 1. At 05:33 hours local time, the first FPV dived into car number 4 behind the locomotive, the fuel car. The 6.5-pound RPG-7 warhead detonated on impact. It was a shaped charge warhead, piercing through the steel skin of the train car and driving a jet of molten metal into the compartment holding 80,000 liters of diesel fuel. The first explosion erupted almost instantly. Columns of black smoke rose into the sky, reaching 350 feet high, visible from the coast 8 miles away. A fireball tore open the body of car number 4. The pressure from the explosion pushed flames out on both sides of the railway, while the train's emergency braking system continued grinding the steel wheels hard against the tracks. The entire train shook violently. But this was only the opening blow. Only 20 seconds later, the second FPV arrived through the black smoke rolling upward from the fuel car. The smoke column from the first explosion should have made targeting impossible, but the operator was no longer looking for a clear image. He only needed the railway tracks, the distance, and the car number already marked in his mind. Car number 12. The second FPV dived directly into the ammunition car. At the moment of impact, the warhead detonated. A louder explosion roared from the middle of the train. The body of car number 12 was torn open, fire burst from inside, and red-hot metal fragments sprayed into the neighboring cars. But after 10 seconds, no secondary explosion spread toward the cars at the rear of the train. That meant car number 12 had been hit, but the chain of ammunition and weapons behind it had not fully detonated. If the attack stopped here, Russia could still save part of the train. And if the rear section remained intact, the mission had still not achieved its biggest objective. The third FPV immediately changed direction. It was only 250 feet from the target. At this point, the entire screen was nothing but a wall of black smoke, orange fire, and white static. The camera could barely distinguish the shape of the train cars anymore, but the operator knew its position. He had counted. He had memorized it. And he understood that this was the final chance. The FPV cut through the edge of the smoke, appearing for only a brief instant before the target. There was no time for a second course correction. It drove straight into car number 14. A massive explosion followed immediately. This time, the fire did not stop at one individual car. The 150 pounds per square inches blast pressure spread into the artillery ammunition cars behind it, triggering new ignition points along the train. One explosion pulled another after it, pushing flames backward toward the rear of the train. Then it reached the 4 weapons cars at the end of the train. Over the next few seconds, the entire rear section of the railway line was swallowed in fire. A chain of explosions erupted one after another, each one stronger than the last. throwing metal fragments into the air and turning the Crimea supply train into an uncontrollable chain of fires. After the final strike, the Crimea supply train was no longer a train, it had become a chain of explosions stretching along the railway. Fuel car number 4 burned first. Ammunition car number 12 exploded next. Then the strike on car number 13 triggered the rest of the train. The flames spread toward the rear, reaching the 4 weapons cars at the end. One explosion followed another, blasting metal, fuel, and ammunition into the air. 560,000 liters of fuel, along with 725 tons of ammunition and weapons, were destroyed right on the railway line Russia used to supply Crimea. But the damage was not only in what had burned. The tracks underneath were warped by the heat. The concrete sleepers cracked and shattered. The bridge section ahead had been destroyed. This supply route would not be able to operate normally for many hours, even days. And for Russia, every hour the railway was paralyzed was an hour that artillery, tanks, and mechanized units on the front line had to wait for fuel, ammunition, and weapons. That was Ukraine's real objective, not just to destroy one train, but to cut off Russia's firepower supply chain before it could reach the battlefield. That fuel was supposed to feed tanks and armored vehicles. That ammunition was supposed to become the next artillery barrages. But instead of reaching the front line, all of it exploded in Crimea's rear area. The attack also forced Russia to face a much bigger problem. If a moving train deep inside Crimea could still be hit, then no railway line, station, or bridge was truly safe. Russia would have to pull more air defense, electronic warfare, and security forces back to the rear. And every system pulled back to protect logistics was one less system on the front line. Just a few cheap FPVs had forced Russia's entire logistics network to change the way it operates. That is what made this attack more dangerous than the initial damage numbers alone. Ukraine does not need to shoot every tank on the battlefield. They only need to burn the fuel before it reaches the tanks. They do not need to stop every artillery gun. They only need to destroy the shells before they are delivered to the firing positions. And after that morning, the message to Russia was very clear. No train is completely safe, no bridge is out of reach, and Crimea is no longer an untouchable rear area. If you believe Ukraine deserves to live in peace and freedom, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Every bit of your support helps more people understand what is really happening in this war. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.